Hello everyone and welcome to the second in our 5-part panel discussion series addressing some of the fundamental issues and opportunities of Canada's EV charging infrastructure. I'm Nino Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy Canada, and I'm delighted to introduce the second episode in this series, Readying the Grid for EVs, which is sponsored by Alectra.
E-mobility is presenting us with an opportunity to be more meaningful and more relevant to our customers. Transforming our traditional grid to one that allows EVs to flourish is part of the purpose and focus of Alectra going forward.
By 2035, 100% of cars and light-duty vehicle sales in Canada are mandated to be zero emission. Alectra is testing, developing, and accelerating new energy solutions so that whoever wants to drive clean has the ability and choice to do so.
Our pilot programs are aimed at supporting our communities as they transition to sustainable transportation. With customized solutions for drivers and businesses, our initiatives like Electra Drive at Home, Electra Drive at Work, and Grid Exchange are helping us to understand the challenges of establishing and managing EV charging.
We are creating solutions to enable tomorrow's clean energy future today.
For more information on Alectra's e-mobility initiatives, visit us at alectra.com.
We're grateful to Alectra for their support in enabling this discussion series. Well, this is a hot topic. We have just under 500 registrants for this session. And so there's obviously keen interest in how we're preparing our grid for a future full of EVs. As the number of EVs on the roads increases, we're going to need an increasing amount of power to keep them moving. And so from power generation to transmission to distribution at a local level, there are lots of challenges and investments and new behaviors that are required to prepare for these increased demands. But there are also opportunities to use EVs, which are, in one regard, huge batteries on wheels, to play a supporting role for the grid, bringing enhanced resiliency and cost advantages to, for example, vehicle owners and building owners. And that's what the panel will be discussing today. And I'm excited to introduce the speakers that we have who will be addressing this topic. They are Bronwyn Lazowski, Senior Policy Advisor, Natural Resources Canada. Cara Clairman, President and CEO at Plug and Drive. Matthew Sachs, Chief Operating Officer at Peak Power Inc. Daniel Carr, Smart Cities Head at Electra Utilities. And my colleague, Emma Jarratt, Managing Editor of Electric Autonomy Canada, who will be moderating today's discussion. On to that, over to Emma to start the discussion.
Thanks, Nino. So welcome, everybody. Very nice to have you all. Cara, could I ask you to kick us off? Plug and Drive speaks to both sides of the equation here, customers and industry. Could you start us off by giving some insight into who EV grid readiness is an issue for?
Right. Well, thanks to you, Emma and Nino, for including me here today. This should be fun discussion. Look, I'd like to start just by saying, this comes up often, even from consumers. They're concerned, well, if everyone has an EV, what is going to happen? And I would say, the response, talking to utilities across the country, and I think we'll hear from specifically from Alectra today, but from in general, what we're hearing is most utilities are saying not to worry, it's in hand. Yes, we will have to make modifications. We will have to do upgrades. But we're going to have time because this doesn't happen overnight. This is going to be, a progression, and we're going to be able to, deal with problem areas, for example, as they arise. So, for the most part, I would say utilities are saying we've got this. And but what we hear, I think, more specifically from the consumer side is more, not so much will the grid be ready, but more of a concern about whether they can adopt an EV because perhaps the grid in their area might have difficulty managing, and perhaps that they're going to be cut off of power because there's too many EVs, for example, charging on one transformer. Or we hear, well, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen to electricity prices. So, you know, am I going to sign up for this and then be stuck with a very expensive source of fuel? And finally, like, are they really clean? Because what's the source of my electricity? And so I would say those are the primary concerns we hear, all of which, by the way, we have a good answer for. And if we want to spend some time on the answers or solutions, I'm happy to do so. But I think these are the main things that we hear from consumers.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, anything you can share in terms of, the questions that come in the door and also the answers that are given.
Sure.
Great.
Well, we're really lucky here in Ontario where our grid is relatively clean already. If you're going to plug in your car here in Ontario at night, you're going to plug into about 95% GHG free, to the extent that anything is free of GHGs. We're running around, typically in the daytime around 7-8% natural gas. Now that could rise depending on how well we plan out our future generations. So that's important to keep in mind. But as of right now, our grid is very clean. And across Canada, you hear the same story. In most jurisdictions, the emissions are low. If you think about Alberta and Saskatchewan, they're still running a bit on fossil fuels, but pretty much the rest of the country, if you take British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, it's all hydro. So even lower emitting. And then, you take Nova Scotia or, the maritime provinces, it's a mix. And Alberta and Saskatchewan, even there where there's a lot of fossil running on the grid, you're still going to see about a 25 to 30% emission reduction there because, of course, the whole grid isn't fossil fuel. And a lot of those coal plants are coming out over the next number of years. So that those emissions are just going to go down. So I think on the emission front, we have a very, strong argument here in Canada. We're actually very fortunate here in Canada to already have the grid kind of cleaned up for the most part. We're kind of in the last mile here on that compared to a lot of other countries. So that's a big plus. And then I would say on the cost of electricity, electricity prices are highly regulated. And so I'm confident that we're never going to see a giant spike in electricity prices. And in fact, here in Ontario, we're about to see this ultra low electricity price come in at night. And so then we're going to actually find it's even cheaper for EV adoption. So I'll stop there and let some other folks chime in. But I think we have good answers to these concerns.
Great. Thanks, Cara. So Matt, Cara obviously just spoke to a lot of the strengths we have right now in our grid. From your perspective, and the work peak power is doing generally, can you scale the issue of grid readiness in terms of, what our current load is, what our capacity will need to be to adopt EVs and the challenges in making the jump between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Emma. So when I like to talk about the issues facing utilities when it comes to grid readiness, I like to use a metaphor to explain the situation because electricity is invisible. It's hard for us to sometimes understand. And moreover, as most of us paying residential bills, we see energy from a kilowatt hour perspective, how much energy is consumed. That's actually not the issue facing the grid. The issue is the kilowatt, the instantaneous demand requirement at any moment on the grid, and especially as we add more vehicles onto the grid. So the problem facing utilities at every scale around the world is that they have to size all of their infrastructure for the moments of peak demand, the hottest hours of the year, or the coldest hours of the year in heating climates, plus 15% for reliability. And every transformer, every generator, every pole, every wire is sized in this way. So the metaphor is, imagine a different type of city infrastructure. Imagine if highways were built with 30 lanes to accommodate Thanksgiving rush hour traffic, 1 hour of the year. But most of the time, those lanes were empty. That's how our grid is basically built. Our grid infrastructure has a utilization rate of about 20%, meaning 80% of the time it's overbuilt, And in urban areas, it's like 10%. So 90% of the time it's overbuilt. So again, going back to the EV question, let's say you have your infrastructure that's been in place since the 1950s, 1960s, and you're starting to bump up against those sizes. Growth is fine until you hit that peak, and then you have to build another lane. And that can be really, really expensive. These are the infrastructure costs that the utilities have to do to allow the grid to accommodate the increased demand of electric vehicles. And this demand can be compounded by, one, the fact that we all have similar driving patterns. We go to work at the same time, we get stuck in rush hour at the same time, we get home and plug in at the same time. So all of the demand is going to occur at the same time. And we all want fast charging. So the faster the charge, the more that you have this increase in demand. So this kind of helps to understand the issues facing the grid, and it can be really expensive. There was a study that was found in the US to accommodate the expected 20 million EVs in the US by 2030. It's going to cost between $75 to $125 billion to accommodate the EVs if you take a grid infrastructure approach. I see 4 potential approaches to getting the grid ready for EVs, and no silver bullet. They all will be required to some extent. The first is increasing grid infrastructure. Again, this is the status quo, but I would make the case that this is the worst scenario from a ratepayer perspective and from an environmental perspective. You're putting more money into the ground, building more infrastructure. You need more generators to be able to accommodate this. So it has an environmental and a societal cost. The reason it's a status quo, even a utility that's motivated to find alternative solutions, there are regulations that require them to grow their infrastructure in certain ways. So there can be kind of a perverse motivation forcing this approach as being the most likely. 3 other approaches, which we're seeing to different degrees, time of use rates to specifically accommodate electric vehicles. Cara mentioned they're calling it the super cheap rate. Well, there's also a super expensive component. There's a 10x difference between charging a vehicle at night. I think it's 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour versus charging during peak times. Again, when everyone is using electricity at 25 cents per kilowatt hour. The other 2 are related to this idea of using storage to balance supply and demand. If you need fast chargers on the grid, then if you co-locate energy storage, you can buffer the impact on the grid by using the power from the battery energy storage system. And I think as we have more and more fast charging and fleet charging, you're going to need more co-located energy storage to manage those increases. And then the fourth, and the solution that I'm most excited about, is vehicle to grid. As Nino said, these vehicles are batteries on wheels. And if the right regulatory structure and price structure is in place, you can actually pay drivers to allow the grid, the utilities, to use the battery in the vehicle when it's otherwise parked. And guess what? Cars are parked 90% of the time. So you can turn your vehicle into a revenue generating asset that's going to help reduce these infrastructure costs on the grid. Maybe I'll stop at that point.
Thanks, Matt. So Dan, I'm looking to you. You have a very good poker face. I cannot tell what you're thinking right now, but I'd love to hear from the utility side what your response to Matt is, and how do they align with the energy distributors' experience with grid readiness?
Sure. Yeah, happy to take that. So just a bit of an introduction. My name is Daniel Carr. I'm the head of the Smart Cities team at Electric Utilities. And in that role, we're basically looking to test out new technologies and business models to understand the energy solutions that will come tomorrow for the problems that we foresee. And within my team, we're really focused mostly on e-mobility these days for obvious reasons. And so, but I also mentioned that I have to spend a lot of time talking with my colleagues and other parts of the business to understand the issues as they see them and potential solutions. So I would say that I agree with a lot of what Matt had said in terms of what the issues are, in terms of seeing increases in load that are being forecasted. And they are, fairly significant, as some of you may know. The actual increase in energy required by the province of Ontario to meet the needs of vehicles to go along with the existing base load is only about 5% increase. So it's not a lot of additional energy that's required, those kilowatt hours that Matt had described, but it's really a capacity issue of the kilowatts, that instantaneous demand meeting the peak. And so we're forecasting that the increase in peak capacity could be 20% or even more that's required. So that's 20% more infrastructure than we have right now to be able to build over the next 20 years. And so that is a significant increase, obviously, and there are implications for that. And I'd say that we are pursuing an all of the above type approach to be able to meet that increase in forecasted demand. And I would highlight the fact that, some people have said like, oh, the grid's not ready. If we all electrify tomorrow, we couldn't. And there's an obvious reason for that, because no one would be happy if we charged everyone, double what their rates are currently, so we could build a system that no one actually needs right now. And so it's a process of, forecasting, planning, and building the infrastructure that's required. And when I say infrastructure, I don't just mean, assets in the ground, but also programmatic infrastructure, ways of interacting with customers, new technologies, so we can actually reduce the amount of charging that happens during the peak and help to fill in those other gaps where the charging is not currently happening and where we've got infrastructure that otherwise would be sitting idle. And so looking at these different options we have available, certainly building infrastructure is one part of it, and that takes time. And it also costs money. And so we're having discussions with our regulator and, providing their forecasts to make sure they understand that, there are things we're gonna have to do on that side. But we're also highlighting the fact that there are other ways of doing things, and that, might not be within the current concept of how utilities are supposed to run. But if we have things like managed charging programs, that's actually a better value to our ratepayers, and can be deployed more quickly if we can encourage people to charge during off-peak times through technology, and also alternative rate programs to help them shift to other times. And so that's a conversation that we're hoping to have some progress on, so we can deploy these other solutions as opposed to just looking at an existing infrastructure system. I'd also highlight the fact that better planning is part of this. And so being able to really forecast where the demand is going to show up so we can prepare for it, because it's not going to be a peanut butter spread of, evenly across our service territory. There's going to be hotspots here and there that we're going to want to be, prepared for. And so if we can be aware of that and plan in advance, then we can be ready when the customer asks, so that they don't knock on our door after they've already done all their planning and hire consultants and engineers and plan out their whole project and knock on our door saying like, okay, we need 15 megawatts for our giant new fleet electrification project. And we say 15 megawatts, like that's going to take 2 years to build that. So we really try to encourage our customers to have conversations with us earlier, and also for us to be ready in the event that they don't. I will highlight the fact that there's already progress going on in some of these areas. So in terms of rate pilots, we were the ones actually at Alectra to pilot the overnight rate that is now going to be deployed across Ontario starting in 2023. So this is where customers can charge their vehicles at home for a very low price during the overnight period, in exchange for a higher price during the day when they likely don't have to charge a car or use other loads as much during the day. And so we're looking to see if there's more that can be done for other types of customers, not just residential. And then also looking at managed charging applications. So we have this being done in a number of different pilot projects that we're running, and we're looking to see how can we commercialize this and make this more available to all customers, not just participants in a pilot program.
Thanks. And I have to ask you a truth-o-meter question. So we're getting a lot of chatter online about Ontario potentially decommissioning one or more of its nuclear plants, and that's basically going to put us up against a generation wall. We don't have the infrastructure to fill the gap. Is that something that we should be worried about, or something that it's manageable?
I think, well, I'll start by saying that, we're a distribution utility, so we don't have our own generation. But it's my understanding the provincial government is very much taking action on this issue, and they're making commitments to do work in this area. So they're looking at adding generation, adding storage capacity. They've extended or applied to extend the Pickering nuclear station for a number of years. So really looking at a variety of different options to try and to fill that gap, because they're aware that these things take time, and that there's a real risk as more electrification load comes that we might not be ready. So I say that's an issue to be aware of, but that I think people in the sector are aware of that and are working towards it.
Thanks. So Bronwyn, I just put in a challenge there, a really big one, at least for Ontario. Our older infrastructure, some of it is wearing out. But on a bigger picture scale across Canada, I've never actually tallied them up, but I imagine there are dozens of grids minimum. What is Natural Resources Canada doing to respond to the various challenges, probably lots of them quite different grid to grid? And anything you want to respond to Cara, Matt, and Dan, or Dan's comments?
Yes, happy to. So for those who don't know me, I'm Bronwyn Lazowski, and I'm a senior policy advisor with Natural Resources Canada. And I would like to preface kind of where I'm coming from. I work in the Office of Energy Research and Development. So really what we're looking at is getting the grid ready for the accelerated adoption of electrified transportation through policy and program development. But specifically what we work on is the policy and program development that supports research, development, as well as the demonstration of new technologies, services, and business models to kind of really get that grid ready for the future. So I would also like to recognize that today I am standing on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Ishibig people, because today I'm presenting from Ottawa. But just want to share that a lot of the work that we do is related to programming, and focusing on those kind of innovative and forward-thinking projects to meet those kind of service models, similar to what Dan was saying earlier about looking at how, if we're unable to build capacity, what are ways in which we can harness the services available within our grid through new types of end uses such as electric vehicles. So I'll touch upon two programs that we work on today that really hone in on kind of these kind of new services at the grid scale. And can also help advance our grid readiness for electric vehicles. So the first one is the Smart Grid program, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's a $100 million program over 5 years that we operate here within NRCan that focuses on demonstration, deployment, as well as kind of hybrid approaches related to smart grid advancement across the country. We have 21 projects across the country, and the aim of this program is to accelerate smart grid development across the country. So through this program, what's really neat, and like I mentioned before, these smart grid technologies can provide great benefits to the grid by better utilizing existing capacity of electricity assets. They can also help to increase the penetration of renewable generation, as well as to help with the reliability, resiliency, and flexibility of our power system. The Smart Grid program works with a variety of technologies as well as business models within the 21 projects that we support. And these projects are delivered by utilities across the country as well. The technologies that we operate in are distributed energy resource management systems, microgrids, distributed energy storage, grid monitoring, and automation. But of course, we also support multiple projects in EV integration. One of them is actually the Electric Grid Exchange project, which was mentioned in the introductory video today. But the second program that I'd like to highlight that's related to electric vehicles is our Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Demonstration Program, or EVID, for those of you who might be familiar with it. So it's a $76 million program, and it supports the demonstration of next generation and innovative EV charging. And a variety of these projects address grid challenges in a number of ways, including load management, as well as novel business models at multi-unit residential buildings and workplaces. We also support projects that look at bi-directional charging with energy storage. They also look at grid impacts and vehicle-to-grid applications, as well as innovative charging hardware and software. And there's 3 projects that I'd like to touch upon quickly to kind of bring some examples to light. So the first one is put forward by Geotab Incorporated. And this project specifically demonstrated that a smart charge rewards program, or smart signals, through prices, can reduce the need for electric infrastructure upgrades and can shift loads locally, which is kind of what I was speaking to earlier about, helping with the existing capacity. Additionally, we support a project that is put forward by Blackstone Energy Services Incorporated. And the objective of this project is to demonstrate a cost-effective vehicle-to-grid system that utilizes the stored energy in electric vehicle batteries during periods of peak electricity demand to provide cost savings to facility operators. And then the last one I would like to share is TransLink, which is put forward by the City of Brampton and Newmarket Tay Power. And these projects accelerate the development of international standards for overhead charging systems associated with heavy-duty transit buses, which is another problem that could hit our grid related to MHDVs within our system. This project also provides utilities and transit agencies with access to data associated with electric bus fleet operations, which is also an important component when we're looking at planning for grid system needs for the future. So those are just some examples of the spaces that we're operating in to kind of look at the future technologies, business models, and services that we can use within our existing grid capacity.
Thanks, Bronwyn. So Matt, there's a lot of choice there. Can you build off of Bronwyn's insights into what the government is doing to support grid readiness for EVs, and say how that's landing with companies like Peak Power that are trying to develop resilient grid technologies?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I probably should have mentioned a bit more about my background in the intro. So Peak Power is a Canadian clean technology company. We develop innovative solutions for managing distributed energy resources. So our primary business is putting batteries in buildings, but the tie to electric vehicles is, of course, we see electric vehicles as what's going to become the most ubiquitous distributed energy resource, those batteries on wheels approach. I often share the story of Peak's kind of growth. We've been around since 2016. Now we started with 3 of us. Now we're over 60 staff. We have been beneficiaries of innovation programs through the federal government and provincial government, and I'm really proud of it. It's not easy. There's quite a bit of due diligence. There's a lot of thoroughness in what they do. But these programs really do help to leverage innovations and make them commercial ready. So Bronwyn mentioned a number of programs, 2 of which Peak is directly involved in, the Smart Renewable Energy Pathways program. We have 5 projects that are receiving a portion of funding from that. And under ZEVIP, the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, if I got that right, we received some funding to develop V1G technology, basically throttling the chargers during these forecasted moments of peak demand. So, you have to look at it as an ecosystem where everyone's got a role to play. The government has to set direction, and the most practical way that they can put weight behind that is with funding for pilots. Of course, the utilities, and Alectra is really a leader in this, can do those demonstrations of what a smart grid model can look like. And of course, a role for the private sector in taking chances and trying out different technologies and seeing what's successful. So I've been a big fan of a lot of the strategies and programs put out by NRCan.
And is there a pathway in particular that you think is the most beneficial at this time for the grid? And,
I have to almost guard myself here. About 2 years ago, I did a cross-country stakeholder kind of approach to lobby the government on what I felt was required. And basically what I think we need is pilot projects that show the value of the different services of distributed energy resources rather than capital cost reductions. So what I mean by that is the utility rate structures, in my opinion, in most regions in Canada, aren't ready for this growth of distributed energy resources. There is no mechanism where I can get paid to do vehicle to grid in Alberta. It doesn't exist. So my opinion is that that's where the government can show leadership, utilities can show leadership, is developing the rate structures that actually create value behind these services. And I think that that's more valuable than putting money into capital cost reductions without the rate structures in place.
Thanks. So Cara, that dovetails really nicely into something I wanted to ask you about, consumer awareness about their options when it comes to leveraging their EV and the grid. we've obviously heard a whole menu of different avenues that are possibly going to be explored in the future. Is there enough awareness and education in people driving EVs for them to be able to advocate or choose in a strategic way what would work best for them?
I'd say in a word, no. I mean, we're still, I sort of, Joe, like I've been at this 12 years, and I'd say we're still kind of at EV 101 in terms of how we talk to consumers. And not to say that they can't understand it, but they just haven't had the opportunity to learn about it. So we're still at the stage of helping people understand that there are lots of different car options, and that these cars can go on the highway, and that there's and that they have the range that people need, and that they can meet their needs. I mean, we're still talking about that. So when you talk about sort of opportunities in terms of V2G, like, I mean, of course, in our crowd here, yeah, we're all, gung-ho on it. I see a huge opportunity to save the grid money, to reduce emissions. Like, there's so many opportunities, but we're really far away right now from the sort of average consumer having an understanding of that. I think what we need to do first is help the consumer understand, like, their use of electricity. So, they might come home from work and plug in their car. And if you send the right price signal, like Alectra already proved out with their pricing scheme, which, as Dan mentioned, is now going to be available to everyone. It's like, hey, if you set your timer to charge at, midnight to 4, you're going to pay a much lower price. I mean, people will do that. So we need to send that price signal. And then when we get to the point where, hey, you could actually earn some money with your EV battery, and here's how, I think people will respond. I mean, certainly I see it as a great opportunity. I mean, I know in the chat, there's lots of questions around, and you raised it already, Emma, this issue of, are we going to be short electricity when Pickering comes out? And what are we going to do? Are we going to build gas plants? And, there's many of us, I think most of us, who really don't want that as the solution. We're hoping we can come up with an alternative solution that's low emitting. We better move fast, because this issue is happening, now. And I know the IESO is going back and looking at their forecasts, and every time they reevaluate the forecast, it kind of gets worse, not better. So we need to really quickly figure out, can we do it? And so when, there are pilot programs actually happening right now. Peak Power is doing one, and I know that Hydro One, for example, has one on the books that they're about to do with residential customers to actually kind of do a little V2G. So, I mean, it's coming, but we're in the I would say, just very early days.
Thanks. Sorry, go ahead, Matt. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. Emma, if I could add to that, Cara and Dan both kind of commented on some things that we're seeing in the chat, and I've got an eye to the chat. So I just wanted to add some numbers to this. Ontario is expecting a capacity shortfall by 2030. This is of about 3.5 gigawatts. Okay, so they're doing procurement mechanisms to try and meet this. Could be energy storage, could be natural gas. We hope that it's not that much natural gas. And if Pickering is brought offline, then that number is going to increase substantially. We expect, NRCan expects that by 2030, there's going to be about 1 million electric vehicles in Ontario. Those 1 million electric vehicles would have a available capacity through vehicle to grid of about 24 gigawatts. So more than enough to cover that capacity shortfall. And then you can go further. If we look at all of Ontario's peak demand on the hottest days of the year, every year for the last 5, 6, 10 years, it's between 20 to 25 gigawatts, something around there, depending on how hot it gets. If all of Ontario, 9 million vehicles, were electric vehicle, their cumulative capacity would be about 198 gigawatts. So there is almost not quite a 10x factor in terms of available capacity from these vehicles compared to the demand requirements. So, peak power, we've got a byline. We want to make power plants obsolete. Like, that's our goal. Let's harness the power of these distributed energy resources that people want to buy for mobility reasons. I mean, this is a bonus, right? This isn't even why they're buying the vehicle or the asset. With all of that, I know I get excited about it and there seems like a lot of promise, and I love this panel because we're all kind of online. Again, I echo Cara's comments. We're in very early stages and V2G will not be a silver bullet. I use those numbers to show the potential of it, not to say this is the solution to all of our problems. It's one piece of the puzzle.
So Dan, what do you think? Obsolete grids, obsolete power plants?
Yeah, well, I think I take Matt's point that we want to try and limit the amount of infrastructure that we have to build. I mean, that's just more efficient for everyone if we don't have to spend the time and money to build something new. If we can stay more within the infrastructure that we've already got, that's just better for everyone to avoid that cost. I would highlight, we still need the electricity to be generated in the first place. Like V2G is great, but the energy has to come from some of the car's not generating the energy, right? So if we can, fuel the vehicle at night and then have it provide energy during the day, that's great. But the energy has to come from somewhere, and it has to be shared along a network of infrastructure, either at the distribution and or the transmission stage of things. So just wanted to highlight that. But there is certainly infrastructure that we can avoid building. But I also want to highlight the fact that, I think most people on this call and on the panel will think that EVs are a superior technology and a benefit to society. We're getting fewer emissions. We're saving money on fuel by using lower cost electricity. But I think it's okay to spend some of those savings on building up the electricity system so that we can make sure that we've got the capacity there. Like we're at 24 gigawatts in Ontario right now. We weren't at 24 gigawatts 100 years ago. We weren't even at 1. So the fact that we might go from 24 to 27 or whatever the number might be to be able to meet that need is still going to be beneficial, because we're going to be spending less money on gas that we're importing. We're going to spend the money in the province to build up the electricity system. And that's something that's used not just for charging vehicles, but can also be used to electrify buildings or just, fuel the energy requirements that we've got today. So just wanted to highlight some of those points.
Thanks, Dan. And that brings me nicely to a question that I wanted to ask Bronwyn, just hearkening back to Dan's analogy of the peanut butter spread and how there are hotspots, for grids that are intensively used. It's great to talk about that. And obviously we've canvassed that thoroughly, but there is an equity piece to this where we also have to acknowledge there are places in Canada that are not on grids. So how is the government going to make sure that, they're increasing capacity and also bringing access to energy equity to the jurisdictions in Canada that don't yet have it?
Yeah, thanks, Emma, for raising that. It's a really great point to bring up, just to acknowledge, the energy piece that's required across the entire country. And so we do have existing programming that we enable to help those communities that are considered off-grid at this point, and also to help bring energy equity and capacity building that also involves the skills, the workforce, as well as the knowledge within these communities. We have a variety of programs. We have the Clean Energy for Rural and Remote Communities program. We have the Indigenous Off-Diesel Initiative program. And then we also have our Northern Reach program as well. And all of these programs are currently working together under one intake in order to reduce barriers for applicants. So applicants can apply under one application, and then they will be looked at within that area, within our experts as well. So this work is really bolstered by our government mandate, that is to support the transition of Indigenous communities from reliance to diesel-fueled power to clean, renewable, and reliable energy by 2030. And these programs prioritize Indigenous and community-led renewable energy projects that are developed by and for the community, which is an incredibly important piece throughout this transition. In order to make it more accessible for these communities, it really takes a community-centered approach and offers flexible timelines. They also provide hands-on support and meet communities wherever they're at, while also facilitating engagement and dialogue throughout the process. And many of these projects equip communities with increased renewable electrical generation power, but they also have projects that focus on building the capacity within the communities so that the workforce, the skills, and the knowledge is embedded within the community itself. So it's a community-led and a community-owned initiative, which is incredibly important. Through these projects, we have seen an increased self-determination as well as the reduction of diesel use for these particular communities for electrical energy, which is incredibly important if we're looking at bringing more EVs to the grid. So there's a lot of these projects and a lot of these programs, but I really want to emphasize that when we're doing these projects and programs, the focus is on that they're community-led, community-owned, and that is building capacity from an energy perspective, but also from a skills, knowledge, and workforce perspective as well.
Thanks, Bronwyn. So we are about at the point where we are going to dive into audience questions, and you've all made it very easy on me because you've been answering them as we go. Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone appreciates that because we have a lot. To start us off, Cara, many of the proposed solutions, managed charging, V2G, will not work unless EVs are connected to the network. So how can you create a customer behavior of plugging in while at home or at work?
Yeah, if you're okay with it, Emma, before we lose the equity piece, I wanted to just add one thing. And,
Totally.
it's amazing what some of the programs that are available. One of the things that I'm seeing as someone who talks to a lot of consumers is, of course, EVs are more expensive, and we have some incentive and rebate programs which are helping on that score. But what we found is most Canadians, or a lot of Canadians, in particular middle to lower income Canadians, do not buy vehicles outright. They finance them or lease them. And for whatever reason, EV leasing financing costs are much higher than gas car costs. And we need to figure out why this is. There's really no explanation for it other than maybe a supply and demand issue because the supply of vehicles is low. But we need to do something about that because it's not right that if you want to buy a gas car, equivalent gas car, you can get it at 1%, but an EV is 5%. And so we do need to sort of figure out a solution there to allow people to get into an EV at a better, more affordable financing rate. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But in terms of vehicles connecting to the grid, I mean, I think, a lot of this will happen organically as as people become informed and grow into it. So, for example, many of us are working from home more and more. The time of use signal is going to tell us charge at this time, not at this time. The cars are super smart. That we can do today, no problem. Where it gets tricky is, of course, the bi-directionality. I mean, most of us cannot do this right now. One of the, I think, like relatively easy solutions to this, I think, would be sort of utility-led, because as an individual consumer, I have no incentive to choose a bi-directional charger. It costs more, and it really today does not benefit me. So why would I do it? But if there in the future is going to be a utility program where I could offer some of my power into the grid and they're going to pay me for that, I have to know about that. And the utility has to perhaps incentivize me to choose a smart charger over a dumb one. And the difference in price is not that much. Like right now, like a dummy runs around $700 and a super smart one runs around $1,200. So we're talking $300-400. That's a difference that a utility could say, hey, consumer, we'll pay the difference of this if you'll agree to let us, take control of your charger at peak times, and you will shift you off of that 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 p.m. or whatever it is. So I do think there's going to be solutions like that to help the consumer. But the longer we wait, the more of us who are going to buy the wrong kind of charger, and that's what's going to become ubiquitous. So we sort of have to get on that. before we even have the programs, which is now. And I so far never seen a utility doing it other than maybe in the States where they're actually running programs right now. But I'd like to see a Canadian utility, sort of start with something like that.
So, Bronwyn, that was actually one of the audience questions: is NRCan providing funding for the installation of bidirectional EV chargers? Bracket from me, or will they in future? And if yes, right now, which projects have been funded?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of programming right now, there are programs for sure related to charging infrastructure at both the at-home level as well as within public spaces. It's not specific to bidirectional, but I can definitely put a link in the chat to the projects that are funded at this point in time. I would also like to jump in on what Cara was mentioning about the piece related to, bidirectional and also kind of issues related to standardization. We recently had a request for information looking at electric grid readiness for increased and accelerated adoption of EVs. And one of the kind of pieces that we received when we were looking at the trends from our respondents, there was a really key theme about the importance of standardization related to this type of work. And we're seeing this across our electrified end use space where, we don't have the time to be reinstalling new types of chargers when we have this really short time frame to hit our 2050 goals. So definitely, as we're looking at all of the electrified end use, I think standardization for the purposes of maintaining interoperability is incredibly important. And I just wanted to share that.
Amazing, thank you. And Dan and Matt, I think you both could answer this one. Are grid managers planning for electrification of not just EVs, but much more? For example, electric heat pumps, which are gaining popularity. BC and the federal government have rebates for installing heat pumps. Any comments there?
I'll jump in. Sure. I would say that, yes, that's being explored as well. And the impact of heating electrification, I'd say, is even bigger than from electric mobility. And so that's, we look at the increase in capacity for EVs, then you look at heating as well. That's, I don't know if an order of magnitude bigger, but certainly much bigger than that. And that's definitely a consideration going forward as to how much we want to invest in the electricity system and what the trade-offs are between gas and electricity. Certainly there's benefits from an emission standpoint of using electricity, and also cost up to a certain point. But when you're looking at how much to expand and how quickly, those are considerations that society's gonna have to make as to what the trade-offs are there.
Could I just add something to that? In regards to the increased demand from heat pumps, of course, it's going to be very significant, and there is a big push for heat electrification across North America and in Canada. Although you can't do the equivalent of V to G, you could do the equivalent of V1G, and that is using the thermal mass of the building as a kind of a battery and reducing the heating demand during those peak hours. So again, going back to the metaphor and the understanding, these peak hours don't last weeks or days. They're hours, in some cases even 15 minutes when the grid is at risk. So if the utility has visibility into this, and if they have the software controls or a price signal with third-party aggregators, you can send a signal out to reduce the heat required during those moments without impacting tenant comfort or comfort of the facility because of the thermal mass of the building. And if you get really smart, you can put sensors in those buildings to check the temperature and ensure that it stays within a comfort range. And if you're really smart, you can predict when this is going to occur. You can preheat the facility before the hour and then throttle it back during that specific hour. So that even with heat pumps, and it's not the discussion for today, there are a lot of analogous strategies to help manage it without just building more poles and wires.
And Emma, just to throw in a personal experience. So I just put in a heat pump and it is running a lot of the time. I notice it is a pretty consistent, constant demand all the time. But on the bright side, as Dan mentioned, these trade-offs, I mean, I'm using like literally no gas. Well, so I am using more electricity. I'm using a lot less gas. And, from a greenhouse gas perspective, excellent. From my personal cost perspective, I don't know yet. I haven't really had a chance to look over the bills. I'll let you know. But I do think this is a choice a lot of us are going to make if we're making choices based on emissions.
So building off of that, trade-off scenario, from a grid development perspective and limiting how high that peak demand can reach, are there any policies being considered in limiting how many homes can EV chargers have? And I would like to hear actually from all the panelists on this, because I feel like each of you brings a different perspective on this. It means something different to each of your different slices of this problem. Does anybody want to bravely start this? Okay, I will.
I'll jump in first, maybe just to say, I don't know that there's any sort of policy. I mean, the customers can do what they want. At some point, it's going to cost them money if they need to upgrade their electrical panel, if they need to upgrade the surface of the street. There's a charge for that. In our service territory, we don't charge a customer, like a residential customer, to upgrade the transformer on the street. If they're the one who requires a bigger transformer, we don't charge them the $20,000 to the cost to replace that transformer, but there's still a cost to the customer of having to rip up the wires to go to the street and upgrade the electrical panel. So I think that there's going to be like a natural winnowing down of how many people are going to be wanting that much load at their house.
I mean, from a consumer point of view, I would say that where we hear about it more is folks who currently have 100 amp service and are, getting an EV and realizing like they don't have enough room on their panel probably to have an EV. So they're going to have to go to 200 amp service. And in a lot of the suburbs, I would say, or newer areas, a lot of houses already have 200 amp service. So this isn't so much of an issue. But in like downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa, older cities, there were a lot of houses built with 100 amp service, or townhouses often have 100 amp service. So that's where you get into that issue. I mean, we're a 2 EV family. We just switch the cars. We don't have extra chargers. And the thing with the EV is that most of us are only needing to charge really once a week. And I sometimes think that the amount of charging that someone is going to do is overstated. Like, most of us are not driving that as much as all that. And so it actually really doesn't, you can have probably a whole bunch of EVs and it still wouldn't change things that much. You would just alternate. And so I don't see it as a significant issue.
I'll just add a 2 cents here. I'm not directly related to this. I certainly hope that's not the case, that utilities will limit that. I hadn't heard of that before, but there is certainly an issue on the very local scale. We can look at all of Ontario and say, yes, Ontario can accommodate the growth of EVs, but it's specific feeders, specific neighborhoods where your neighbor gets an EV and then you get an EV and then Cara gets 2 EVs, and it can have a local impact that can be pretty serious. I have heard scenarios where the utility charges the last person to upgrade, and that to me is not quite fair, if I want to put it that way. And I don't think anyone sees it as the path forward. It's kind of a remnant of existing regulatory structures where it's a philosophy of the person that forces the upgrade should pay for it. But if they are only forcing it because they're the last on the block, but everyone else didn't require the upgrade, again, think of the highway metaphor, the last car, should they pay for the whole new lane? Doesn't make sense. You should have the costs structured between everyone. So I think that there is some planning that needs to happen there to ensure that's not the case. I haven't heard of utilities limiting the allowance of chargers, but it's not an impossibility. It just needs some pre-planning to come up with better options for it.
I think the more likely scenario is to try to, with pricing, encourage people to charge at off-peak times and things like that, rather than actually limiting someone's charging altogether.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in briefly. In terms of the policy side, I haven't really seen too much of that, but I would like to share another finding that's kind of related to this conversation that we had from our request for information. And what was brought up across our respondents was really the need for innovation and regulatory frameworks and rate design to support this accelerated adoption of EVs so that they can provide the grid services that they can provide, and also to make sure that consumers don't bear the end cost of it as well. So we've heard that from multiple regulators across the country, and just wanted to share that insight. It's also quite related to what I'm working on as the lead of the Innovation and Electricity Regulation Initiative here at NRCan, so that we can look at, how are we looking from an electrified end use perspective? How can we look at innovation and rate designs and regulatory frameworks at large?
I like leaving it on that cliffhanger. We're going to get more information coming our way soon. Thank you, everybody, so much for your insights and time on this panel. We really appreciate it. It's a really important discussion. And I will pass it back to Nino now to wrap us up.
Thanks very much, Emma, and big thanks to you, especially for moderating the discussion today. And I'd like to add my thanks to the panelists, Bronwyn, Matthew, Cara, and Daniel, for taking time out to share their knowledge and to really go through quite a few questions there. A massive thanks to the audience as well. We received over 60 questions, so I'm sincerely sorry we didn't get to them all, but I hope you got a good sample that came through. I'd like to just once again provide a big thanks to our sponsor, Alectra Utilities, for sponsoring today's panel discussion and making it possible. And also to let you know that next week we have in fact two expert panels next week, but the first one we have next week on Wednesday is where we will discuss how we simplify the EV charging experience. And there's certainly lots to unpack there and lots for us to solve. So we've got another great panel of experts coming forward. So please make sure that you visit electricautonomy.ca to register for that event in particular. You'll need to register for that individually. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.